My life took a sudden and disorienting turn when I was about 9 years old. It seemed that my world, which had been so stable and understandable before, literally fell apart. My parents, whom I have always perceived as a single whole, as a model of harmony and mutual understanding, suddenly announced their divorce. This message hit me like a bolt from the blue. I've always heard stories from friends about their parents' stormy and painful breakups, full of screams, quarrels, and dramatic scenes, but my childhood wasn't like that. My parents were calm and reasonable, as if their decision had been thought out in advance and carefully weighed. They spoke directly, without hesitation and unnecessary emotions, that now each of them has found a new partner. My mother decided to move in with her new friend, while my father invited his new lover to live with us. They promised that we would live just a few miles apart, that I could easily divide my time between the two houses, and that they would do everything to make me feel happy and loved. They offered joy trips, gifts, new gadgets, everything that, in their opinion, could brighten up this time and smooth out the changes in my life. But in fact, no material benefits could overshadow the deep and unbearable pain that I was experiencing. All I really wanted was to restore the lost unity of our family, to see Mom and Dad under the same roof again, as it was before. But the reality turned out to be different. I watched my mother pack her things and leave our house, and my father's new companion began to take her place. Every day I felt like our house was filled with people and feelings that were strange to me. The feeling of loss, disappointment, and loneliness only intensified. In addition, the children of my father's new partner moved in with us, two twin boys my age, who, apparently, were not at all interested in my presence in their lives. Our relationship was cold and aloof, reflecting my own emotions towards them. When I visited my mother's house, I found no solace there either. Mom quickly created a new family with her friend, and I felt that I no longer belonged to her life, that my place among them had been lost. This breakup with my parents and the feeling that I had been cut out of their new reality pushed me to seek support elsewhere. Over time, I found solace with my aunt, my father's sister, who was also my godmother. Her house became a safe haven for me, a place where I could be myself without feeling alienated or unwanted. My mother assumed that I spent more time with my father, and vice versa, as if they both couldn't or didn't want to realize that I was essentially left on the sidelines of their new lives. Their lack of involvement in my fate was becoming more and more obvious. Both of them were passionate about their new families, as if their own past, of which I was a part, had turned into a barely noticeable shadow. Living with my aunt has become a real salvation for me, a breath of fresh air in a lifeless desert. Her attention and care filled the void that her parents had left. Her simple gesture, to invite me to dinner or to go to the cinema together, made a huge difference. And trips to my grandfather's farm during the summer holidays were remembered by me as moments of genuine happiness. There, among the quiet nature, for the first time in a long time I felt the calmness that I had been missing. These moments, filled with simplicity and warmth, helped me to feel like a part of something meaningful again, to feel real affection and care. My father initially sent me a monthly allowance to support me financially. However, over time, even this gesture turned into a burden for me. Sometimes his aunt reminded him of this, but more often she didn't want to burden him and just let things take their course. I started taking responsibility myself, working part-time at her nursery after school and helping around the house. These simple tasks, taking out the trash, running errands, didn't seem burdensome to me, but rather a way to thank her for the care and attention she showed me. Despite my aunt's care, deep down I realized that my parents had strayed too far from their parental responsibilities. Every year they became more and more distant, and this became evident in the most important moments of my life. They began to forget my birthdays, and if they called, it was only after my aunt reminded them. Their calls were so casual that they seemed like a formality rather than a sincere desire to chat with me. They never even came to such significant events as my graduation from school. On this important day for me, my aunt was the only person who was there. She was the only one who was really proud of me and shared my successes. When my aunt confronted my parents and expressed her disappointment at their neglect, they only briefly apologized, but their remorse was short-lived. Soon everything returned to normal, their calls became less frequent, and their interest in my life disappeared like a morning mist. I began to accumulate resentment, disappointment, and a sense of injustice inside myself. Over time, I stopped answering their rare calls, which led to a new round of accusations. They accused me of being rude, but I stood my ground. I no longer wanted to participate in their games. I did not want to let their accusations and reproaches affect my determination to live my own life, a life free from emotional neglect and manipulation. Over time, I chose my own path and went to university, deciding to live on my own. However, despite the new stage of my life, I always found time to return to my aunt for her birthdays and holidays. Her unconditional support over the years has meant more to me than words can express. I wanted her to know how much I appreciate everything she has done for me, how deeply her love and care are ingrained in my heart. Recently, my paternal grandfather passed away, and his death shook my mind again, like a cold wind reminds me of past storms. She marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, once again reminding me of those difficult relationships and family dynamics that I have been overcoming all these years. As the end of my university studies approached, I began to think more and more about my experiences and the profound impact my aunt's sincere care had on me. Each time, I became more and more aware of how stark the contrast was between the warmth she gave me and the lack of support from my parents. Losing my grandfather was an incredibly difficult time for my aunt and me. We were both the few who stayed by his side for the rest of his life, who truly shared his last moments with him. This closeness was in stark contrast to the attitude of my father and his brothers, who rarely visited my grandfather, especially in the last years of his life. But, as often happens, they all came to his funeral, with solemn faces and feigned sorrow, although in their life grandfather occupied only the role of a distant relative and not a beloved father. However, the real shock for them came not at the funeral, but at the reading of the will. It turned out that my grandfather left his entire fortune, a house on a farm and $200 million in cash, to my father and uncles, thereby rewarding them for years of absence and indifference. He bequeathed the rest of his fortune to charities. This decision, at first glance harsh, was fully justified. My grandfather was always a man of honor and justice, and despite the fact that his children were far from him in recent years, he did what he thought was right. He knew who had been by his side over the years, and my aunt, his daughter, his companion in recent days, turned out to be the person who deserved his greatest respect and recognition. When my aunt called me home, her house became a real shelter for me again, a place where I felt safe and calm. She told me that she was going to give me the $200 million that Grandpa left. I was stunned, not only because of the money itself, but also because this gesture was the epitome of her deep care and love for me. It was a symbol of her faith in me and my dreams, which I had often discussed with her over the years. In my most difficult moments, I shared with my aunt my desires, dreams of my own business, and independent life. Now, thanks to her support, this dream could become a reality. I was overwhelmed with emotions. Tears of gratitude rolled down my cheeks, and I hugged her, trying to express all the gratitude that had accumulated in me over the years of her endless support and understanding. It was that rare moment in my life when all the past pains and disappointments gave way to the joy that there had always been a person in my life to whom I was truly dear. However, this joy did not last long. Soon the news about the inheritance spread, and my parents suddenly began to show me increased attention. My mother and father, who had barely thought about me before, suddenly began showering me with calls, talking about their unconditional love, inviting me to family dinners, as if they had forgotten about all the years of neglect. I saw how quickly their attitude changed, and it was obvious that they were driven not by love, but by money. My father even came to the university dormitory, which shocked me. He said he was proud of my success and invited me to dinner in honor of the upcoming graduation. His words sounded like nothing had happened, like he hadn't left me all those years. My mother also left a voice message full of enthusiasm for my graduation, reminding me how they always dreamed that I would go to university and realize my abilities. But underneath her joy, I sensed an ulterior motive, her desire to be around again, just to get some of the money she found out about. These sudden displays of caring seemed fake to me, and the idea that they would be at my graduation seemed unwelcome and unfair. I felt two opposite feelings fighting inside me. On the one hand, I understood that perhaps this was a chance to restore family ties, to regain something of the lost years, but on the other, the pain and disappointment from their previous actions still weighed heavily on me. Now I was torn between the opportunity to give them a second chance and the desire to leave everything behind, to continue my journey without their presence in my life. Since my aunt was left alone, her life has been filled with taking care of the garden and plants. My cousin and I repeatedly suggested that she go on a date, try to find happiness with someone again, but she always replied with a smile that she had already found her peace and joy in this secluded world of nature. She tenderly cared for each plant, as if it were a living being, giving them the love and care that she once gave to my brother and me. Many of you may think that I was too strict with my parents, pointing out that they had every right to break up and start life with new partners. Of course, I agree that every adult has the freedom of choice, the freedom to seek happiness in a new relationship. However, I firmly believe that such freedom should not become an excuse for neglecting your children. Once you decide to start a new family, you can't just forget about your first one, and that's exactly what my parents did. When they first broke up, it was agreed that I would spend 1 week with my mother and then with my father. But from the very beginning, I felt that my presence was just a burden to them, interfering with their newfound personal life. The time I spent with them often turned into waiting for them to go about their business, as if my being with them was an unwelcome reminder of the past. When I heard phrases like, "She's here now, so we'll go out next week," my heart was bursting with pain. In my childish eyes, I saw this as clear evidence that I had become a stranger in their new worlds. Mom moved in with her new partner pretty quickly, and soon she got pregnant. They didn't hide their feelings for each other, and their open displays of affection always put me in an awkward position. It was especially hard to come to terms with this, being just a child who barely had time to get used to the separation of his parents. One day they took me on a 3-day trip, and instead of spending time together, they left me alone in a hotel room. They went to sunbathe, and when they returned, they asked me to sit on the balcony so that they would have freedom. I was only 9 years old, but I already understood what was going on. I knew why they didn't want me around, and it broke my childish heart. After a particularly painful trip with my mother, when I was left alone in a strange place, almost isolated from them, I decided to stop visiting her. My father was doing a little better. At least sometimes he tried to include me in his plans, but his new stepsons threw tantrums because of my presence, forcing him to postpone our events. He always said, "Let's skip it this time, maybe next week." But when this next week came, there was no time left, and I returned to my mother's house again, feeling forgotten and unnecessary. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. My parents seemed to be secretly passing me around to each other, like an unnecessary suitcase that needed to be temporarily disposed of. They promised, "We will definitely do something next week," but these promises never came true. I went on vacation with my father and his new family several times, but I felt completely unhappy there. His wife and her sons monopolized his attention, and I often found myself on the margins of their family idyll. During family photos, they asked me to take pictures of them, making sure that I did not appear in any of the pictures myself. Remembering this, I understand why I have been so hard on my parents in recent years. When they found out about my upcoming graduation from the university and started talking about how proud they were of me and how they wanted to celebrate this moment, I took their words with great skepticism. Where was that pride when I graduated from high school? Where were they when my classmates were taking pictures with their parents, and only my aunt was standing next to me? My parents insisted on coming to my graduation, but I didn't send them an invitation. I took care to hide the exact date of the ceremony from them, and as I expected, they eventually forgot about it. It's been almost a month since I graduated, and my parents haven't contacted me to confirm dates or discuss anything important. Their sudden interest disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and I finally realized that this interest was just an excuse, an attempt to re-enter my life when it was convenient for them, nothing more. The latest update came 3.5 months after graduation. My mom called me and enthusiastically informed me that my stepsister Ellie had completed elementary school and was now enrolled in a prestigious private school. But, as it turned out, Mom's joy was overshadowed by financial difficulties. Funds for Ellie's education suddenly ran out, and she turned to me. I was stunned by this call. My mother, after such a long silence, unexpectedly called, not to ask how I was doing after graduation, or to congratulate me on my new successes, but to ask me to finance the education of a girl I had never even seen. Her argument was simple. You have money left by your aunt, $200 million. You have to help your sister, because now you are an older brother, she needs you. She tried to appeal to my sense of responsibility and duty, but I was unable to take her words seriously. My head was literally boiling with indignation. I wanted to shout back, "Where were you when I needed a mother myself? When I was alone, sick and abandoned?" But instead I held back. Calmly, though with increasing inner tension, I told her that I had my own plans for money, and I did not intend to help anyone. Her reaction was predictably abrupt. She ended the conversation with a note of resentment, not even bothering to ask about my graduation. This only confirmed my worst suspicions. Their interest was purely financial, and not dictated by love or care. As soon as I thought that I had already experienced all possible manifestations of cynicism, a new blow awaited me. A few days later, the bank called me to discuss the unpaid obligations on the mortgage that my father had issued. I didn't understand how they got my number until I found out that my father had given it to the collectors himself, as a contact person. It turned out that he had taken out a large consumer loan and was delaying payments. When the collectors began to harass him, he decided that the best way out would be to redirect them to me, hoping that I would help pay off his debt. The situation completely overwhelmed me. I didn't know what to do and what legal obligations I had. Not wanting to immediately confront my father, I turned to a friend who was graduating from law school for help. Although he was not yet a practicing lawyer, his knowledge proved useful. He assured me that I had no legal obligation to pay my father's debts. The bank was just trying to contact me, believing that I could pay, but I had every right to refuse. When the bank called again, their foreclosure agent began to behave rudely and aggressively, trying to intimidate me and force me to pay. This time I was ready and confidently confronted. "Who gave you the right to speak to me in such a tone? I am not responsible for this debt. Contact the debtor." After my reply, the agent suddenly fell silent, and then apologized and hung up the phone. A few hours later, a new call came, this time from my father's wife. She was furious, shouting at me, accusing me of being heartless. "Your father is struggling to pay off the mortgage, and you just turn away from him, even though you have all the means to help." Her voice trembled with anger. But I remained calm. With icy calmness, I told her that I didn't have to help my father, since he never put me in the first place. He always preferred you and your boys to me. Why don't you all help him? My voice was even, but it hid years of accumulated disappointment. This answer completely knocked her off balance, and she broke off the conversation as abruptly as my mother had a few days earlier. That evening, for the first time, I truly realized that I needed to protect my borders and financial security, despite any attempts to exert pressure. My father called me late at night. His voice was drunk and agitated. He wasn't angry like he used to be, but he was full of apologies. The words were clumsy, but there was genuine remorse in them. He admitted that he had treated me unfairly in the past, especially in front of his stepsons, and now deeply regretted his actions. His voice trembled as he said that he understood how much he had been wrong and would like to make amends. It was unexpected. For the first time in a long time, my father did not speak in raised tones, not because of financial problems, but really sincerely. However, I have already learned to be careful with his words. Despite my apparent remorse, I remained on guard. The past was too painful to let go of so easily. I calmly told him that I did not want to stir up old grudges and did not seek to bring them back into my life. Let him live his life and I'll live mine. In response, he begged for forgiveness, tried to return our communication, but I explained that apologies alone cannot erase years of neglect. I had already adjusted to life without them and didn't want to go back to the past. After these words, I hung up the phone, but doubts crept into my soul. Was I too cruel? Was it worth helping him with his financial problems, especially if it was about paying off the mortgage? Years of detachment, of course, left a mark, but could money have become a symbol of some kind of reconciliation? These thoughts did not leave me, and I wondered if it would be worth helping my father after all. Some of my friends also said that it would not be difficult for me to cover several payments. It would hardly affect my financial condition. At one point, I was almost ready to call my father and offer help, but I didn't have time. Before I picked up the phone, I received an email from my mom. In it, she apologized for missing my graduation and offered to meet at dinner, she, me, my father, and her husband. Mom promised that it would be a quiet, family evening, in the spirit of the old days, as if nothing had changed. Although I had no desire to go back to the past, I agreed to dinner. Perhaps I was hoping that this would be the last act in this long-running drama, and finally a point would come in our relationship. Dinner began quietly, although there was tension in the air, as if vague intentions were hiding behind every word. My father repeated the same apologies that I had already heard on the phone. Mom added her own, expressing remorse for missing important moments in my life. They seemed to be sincerely striving for reconciliation, but something in all this was too carefully thought out. And suddenly, as if by chance, Mom asked a question. Baby, my father and I are interested in what plans you have for the money from the inheritance. She hurried to add, No, we just want to give you good investment advice. You're still too young to make such decisions alone. I answered her indifferently, Thank you, but I already have a financial advisor, so I'm fine. After that, there was an oppressive silence at the table. After about 10 minutes, my mom decided to try a different approach. She looked at my father, then at me and said, You know your father is having mortgage problems right now. Why don't you help him with the payments? I nodded stiffly and turned to my father, asking a direct question. Why did you take out this loan at all? Was it for business? The father lowered his head, as if ashamed, and muttered that the money went to pay for his son's college. Before I had time to realize the depth of this confession, my mother abruptly interrupted him. It doesn't matter. The fact is that your father is having difficulties right now, and you could help him. Why not pay off his mortgage, and his stepson will pay you back when he gets a job? At this point, I lost my patience. The situation seemed so absurd that I could barely contain my sarcastic laughter. I replied briefly, maybe we should just have dinner in silence and be done with it. But Mom couldn't stand it and exploded. She started screaming, accusing me of being selfish, of always being focused only on myself. Her accusations rained down on me one after another, and I felt the fatigue of this endless pressure growing in me. They knew that I had my own student loans to pay off, but despite this, they expected me to finance my stepbrother's college, Ellie's private school, and, at the same time, manage my debts. At that moment, I realized that it couldn't go on like this. I got up from the table, leaving enough money to cover my part of the dinner, and said, I'm done with you. You only want my money, and you know you won't get it. Goodbye. I walked out without looking back.